all of you, and thanking God that He gave us Don Payne, that He gave him sufficient years to make an extraordinary mark here in this country and around the world. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield time to the Dean of the Michigan delegation, Mr. Conyers.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me, and I also thank Donna Christensen for her leadership in bringing us all together this evening. This is a wonderful way when this record is read of this special order for Donald Payne, for everyone to know the depth of the love and respect that we all had for this great and gentle human being. He was a committed public servant and a true champion for social and economic justice at home and around the world. He had a global perspective that helped teach us that all of the 6.4 billion people on Earth are connected and related. And so when I was asked to go campaign for his first run for Congress that I knew about in 1988, I was pleased to do so, and I traveled to Newark and joined with him in that victory. And I remember being struck by his deep desire to help people, and I had no idea that he would grow and develop into this leader that we mourn and praise here today. And through his work as a member of the House Education Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, he led the fight to address inequities in every realm of existence. He was a great proponent for peace. And I must say that I am convinced that he had the spirit and the philosophy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., that he lived and demonstrated every single day of his life. He's the one member that I can say I never saw him angry. I never saw him upset. And when I was able to take him away from his African commitments, I took him to Haiti, where he immediately understood the depth of the suffering and the tragedy that required us to go back again and again and again. And so, Donald Payne, what has been said of you today is only a small token of the contributions that you have made during your life. You'll be missed by your colleagues. You will be mourned by your family. You will be treasured by many people in many places on this globe.
Now take the opportunity to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I want to thank my distinguished friend for your kindness and generosity in yielding the time, and to the Speaker, and I want to thank Ms. Christensen Dr. Christensen for beginning us on this journey. and to the Speaker for being educated by these powerful words of my colleagues. I do want to say that if you had to give a tribute biblically to Donald Payne, you would certainly quote from Timothy in saying that I fought the good fight. And I am grateful to also say that Donald Payne had a lot of fun in life. Some of us can trace our friendship to years past, to decades past. But I know that as the world loves Donald Payne, he loved some Newark and New Jersey. I had the good pleasure of joining him and his friends during the last Congressional Black Caucus, when we have a variety of receptions to meet our constituents, and there was nothing but love in that room. I had, I would call it, a humble privilege to visit him at Georgetown Hospital, where his brother and sister are in the room, his chief of staff, and to have him smile, as some of our colleagues have said. But in the course of being in the room, I heard that the former president of South Africa, President Mbeki, was trying to reach him. There will be a long list of presidents and former presidents and others of great renown trying to reach him. But you cannot in any way doubt the fact that in his acceptance and acknowledgement by all of those iconic figures, President Mandela as well, that he, as a progressive, stood along with the family members that he loved, whether it was his son who was a council member and his other children, or Bill Payne. He epitomized the struggles of a generation of African Americans in Newark and New Jersey in the 1950s and 60s, and he was on the front lines of fighting for equal rights out of the North Ward. Oh, leave it only to Donald Payne to talk about New Jersey politics, and he loved it. And he had an iconic presence, but he also had a leadership boss man presence, and I say that lovingly, because if you needed something in that area, and as my good friend Brother Pallone and Pasquale out of that area knew, that no matter who you were in his district and needed something, you could get a hold of Don Payne. He loved the richness of his district and its diversity, but you can be sure that he was fighting for the poor and dispossessed. And maybe that's what brought him to his affinity and kinship for Africa. My predecessor, one of my predecessors, Mickey Leland, who Don Payne knew, we always say died on the side of an Ethiopian mountain trying to feed those who could not feed themselves. But Don Payne was everywhere, from Ethiopia to Sudan to South Africa to Angola to the Congo to Ghana and Liberia. He was in all of those, if you will, conflicts where he wanted to bring about peace. He counseled presidents, Republicans and Democrats, and I remember Bill Clinton's historic trip. You can be assured that Donald Payne was at the nexus of drawing him to making that historic trip, and I believe in 1998, counseled George Bush and others, counseled President Obama. But I don't know if many of you know that Donald Payne was a longshoreman and worked on many different places, but he is reminded of his work as a longshoreman and said, I love the port, and I heard a member talk about that, I believe, but he loved the working person. Let me just conclude as I salute him for being the progressive who did not forget the poor, and as well could speak eloquently with the leaders of international positions around the world, albeit he was coach and teacher, council member, and Essex freeholder. I remember traveling to Africa on occasions, plural, but in this instance, what I would say, beyond having known that in Somalia he was almost in essence taken down, but if many of you will remember the first Kabila, the father of the present president of the Congo, you will know that that area has always been in conflict, and Donald Payne has never shunned going into conflict. Two places we went, Angola when it was still in conflict, and Donald Payne said, well, I know we can meet the president in his castle and office and place that he is, but I'm going up in the bush, and if you all are with me, we're getting on this little one propeller plane, not two propellers. I thought we only had one, and we're going to go up there and meet with the opponent of the president. We sat with Donald Payne, encouraging this opponent to put down his guns and to come and meet with this president who, through Donald Payne, had promised peace. I know that man wished that he had answered the call that Donald Payne made. He never left the bush, and he died in that place. I got to see him up close and personal, where no risk of life was too much for him to bring about peace. And so as I conclude, let me simply say to the peacemaker, to the intended Nobel peacemaker, to the man who didn't shun or didn't shy away from a conflict that might have taken his life, to the lover of Newark, to the lover of his family and his children, to the lover of his staff, to the lover of this institution, Don, may you rest in peace. Warrior, leader, hero, God knows that you never stop working, and you deserve that angel's place in heaven. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the gentleman from Texas.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first let me say that I join my colleagues in recognizing not only the life and work of Don Payne, but also wanted to add my personal words of support for what Don meant to me personally as a co-chairman of the Caribbean Caucus a number of years ago. Speaker Hastert asked both Don and myself to become engaged in issues that would be considered in our hemisphere as a result of the war on terror. And the Speaker recognized that the Caribbean was a gateway, could be not only for terrorism, but also a number of other issues. And Don and I accepted that role, had a number of trips down to the Caribbean, but also met with Caribbean leaders here in Washington, D.C. Don was always upbeat. Don was always looking for answers and responses to the needs of our friends in the Caribbean, and really found a way to cut some good friendships with people to where they became better friends of the United States Congress and the United States because of his personal involvement in issues and matters. And I enjoyed working with Don. He accepted not only his role and mine, us working together. I as a younger member, he as a senior member, and he welcomed my advances for ideas and thoughts, and it was difficult for me also, and I know as I was walking into the Capitol a few minutes ago to see the beautiful flag that flies outside the United States Capitol at half-mast in honor of our colleague, Don Payne. And so I do want to thank this body for allowing me a chance to express not only my thoughts about Don, but also to recognize him as an outstanding member of this body. Mr. Speaker, I also need to notify this body that I send to the desk a privilege report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the time.
Report to accompany House Resolution 572, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 3606 to increase American job creation and economic growth by improving access to the public capital markets for emerging growth companies.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed.
I thank the gentleman for the time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And may I inquire, Mr. Speaker, how much time we have remaining?
The gentleman has 26 minutes remaining.
I would ask that we have 11 speakers, so if you would limit your remarks, I want to have an opportunity for everyone who wants to speak. And now if I would ask my colleague and one of Don's very dear colleagues from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, yield time to him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a lot of Don Payne stories. I want to tell one which I think says a lot about the man. I listened to what Sheila Jackson Lee said before about how he was always humorous and telling jokes, but also about New Jersey politics and how he was so well respected and had the ability to basically tell other members or indicate to other members what they should do. And I also listened to Hanson Clark when he mentioned Don being a gentleman. Don was a gentleman, and people respected him as such in the city of Newark and throughout his district. There was an occasion after the redistricting when I gained an area, I won't mention the name necessarily, in my new district where that was mostly African American, and Don Payne was very well known there, and I wasn't known at all. I actually live at the Jersey Shore, and some of you may know that the people that are down at the Jersey Shore, the people from North Jersey and Newark often refer to us with names like clam digger and other things to indicate that we're not, you know, as sophisticated as the people from Essex County. So I was at a meeting with African-American ministers in this new area of my district, and of course the purpose of Don being there was to tell them that it was okay. In other words, it was okay that this guy from the shore, the clam digger, so to speak, was now going to represent you because he was okay. But as you know, Don couldn't take an occasion like that without making it into a joke and still getting the point across, but in a very humorous way. So he said to them, to the African-American ministers as we assembled, he said, well, you know, this guy, Frank Pallone, is now coming up here and he's going to represent you, but, you know, he's down at the shore and most of his time he spends talking about crabs and the fish and the things at the shore. You know, I don't know if he can relate to this urban area now that he's going to represent where you all know me. And he said, but I'm going to tell you a story. He says, you know, you often see Congressman Pallone in pictures at the shore picking up crabs, and he picks up the crabs and he talks about how the crab had been injured and it was important to help the crab, and the crab needed some help, it needed to be fixed, needed some health care so it could become a whole crab again and lead a good life. And of course everybody was laughing at this point, figuring, you know, what this is all about. But it was his way of getting across in a humorous way that it was okay to have Frank Pallone represent you, that he was going to relate to you. He could relate to a crab, so he could obviously relate to you. I don't know if I'm saying this properly, but I'm just trying to, this is how Don was. He just was able to use humor to get a point across, a very serious point, in a very effective way. And that's, you know, I will miss him so much because he made me laugh so many times when situations were serious and there didn't seem to be much humor. But he always did it in a way that made me understand how important it was to be here as a member of Congress. And he really understood how important our jobs were and how they could make a difference in people's lives. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Now I'd like to yield to a gentleman also from New Jersey and one of Mr. Payne's very close colleagues, Mr. Ralton.
I thank the gentleman for the time. I thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, today, Newark, the state of New Jersey, and the United States of America lost a hero. And the world lost, especially those who needed help, those who were being persecuted. They lost a champion. For Don Payne's family, they've lost their patriarch, the strong, gentle, warm, beautiful, handsome hero who held them together all these many years. And like so many others, but in a very special way, we lost a dear, dear friend. I love Donald Payne. I know he loved me. We spent many times together as dear friends, buddies, laughing and joking, but also many great times speaking about the very, very serious issues confronting our state, his district, my district, the country, and the world. Donald Payne led an extraordinary life. a young African-American man from very humble beginnings, did not have it easy growing up in America, and didn't have it easy acquiring political power that enabled him to help everyone, whether it was in Newark or Essex County or New Jersey, the United States, or in the world. History will record that this young man from Newark, Donald Payne, literally saved tens of thousands of lives. He did. All over the world. In America, in Africa, and in Northern Ireland. And he was known throughout the world as a champion of the downtrodden, those in need, and a champion of human rights. He was a longshoreman, he was a teacher, he was a waiter, he was an elected official from New Jersey who made us all so proud, but he was a citizen of the world. He was a leader in this world. And he leaves behind a legacy, not only as a beloved husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, brother, family man, but also as a dear, loving friend. And beneath that strong, serious statesman's demeanor was a warm, charming, funny, irreverent, smart, and great friend. I will miss him very, very much. God bless you, Don Payne, my friend. God bless you, Congressman Donald Payne, you iconic figure for America and the world. We will miss you dearly, but we will never forget you.
Madam Speaker, I now yield time from the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, in the book of Ecclesiastes 3:1 and 2, these words are recorded. To everything there's a season, a time and purpose, and to everything under the sun, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. Madam Speaker, today a giant oak tree has fallen. There's a gaping hole in the forest. Don Payne has moved from an earthly life into an eternal heavenly life. A time, a purpose, a season. Don Payne did not take his time, his season, nor his purpose for granted. Every moment, every season, the purpose for which he was created meant something to him. And he gave his life, he spent his life working on his time, his season, and his purpose. Last Friday, Don, through his chief of staff asked me to come to the hospital. And we talked for a while, and he whispered some words to me, some directions for me, some orders from his hospital bed. But what stands out to me on that occasion, last Friday, was his last words spoken to me. We were in the middle of votes. And he said, go and make those votes. Don't miss those votes. And here, a man who knew that he was spending his last hours on this earth, he knew that his life was coming to an end. He had told me some weeks before that he had pancreatic cancer, and he didn't know what was going to happen. But his last words to me was not, woe is me, but he was thinking about public service. He was thinking about this house. He was thinking about me and the vote that I was to cast. He was thinking about a time and a purpose and a season. In the book of Micah, life really becomes quite simple. The prophet Micah asked, or God asked the prophet Micah, what do I require of thee, O man? But to love mercy and do justice and walk humbly before your God. Mr. Speaker, I know that Don passed God's requirement. He lived his life with purpose. He was a son of Africa, but he was also a servant of Africa and a servant of the world. We're all going to miss Don. We all look to Don's being a beacon in terms of public service. I will miss him, and my condolences go out to his entire family and his entire staff. I might add that just this morning, my staff and I went to his office, as others have. We sang a song together. Jesus, keep me near the cross. Don not only had the cross in mind, but now he sits in his heavenly home in a better place. God bless you, Don. God bless you.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I now would like to yield to the gentlelady from California, distinguished gentlelady Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you for yielding. Madam Speaker, it is with a very heavy heart that I rise tonight to honor and commemorate the life of a world leader, but more importantly, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a father, a brother, an uncle, a boss, a dedicated family member to so many. I offer my condolences and prayers to Don's family, to his staff. They need our comfort during these very difficult days. Don was more than a colleague to many of us, myself included. He was a very good friend. We lived near each other in Washington, D.C. here, and I had the privilege to drive him home quite often. These were special moments for me, which I will always cherish. For it was during these rides that he'd counsel me, and he cracked so many jokes to cheer me up, because he always knew what we were going through. And we talked about family and friends and what was really real in our lives. Don loved children, and he relished his membership on the Committee on Education and Workforce. And of course, before coming to Congress, he was the national president of the YWMCA and an elementary school teacher. But yes, Don was also a global leader. And I've traveled abroad with Don, and he was greeted as a head of state and a comrade. But Don didn't especially like traveling with large congressional delegations. He liked going by himself and with his brother to the middle of conflicts, sometimes in the bush and in the jungles, to meet with guerrilla leaders and freedom fighters. He helped negotiate truces, and all sides everywhere in the world loved and respected him. Now, for many years, Don was the lone voice in the wilderness, calling for a declaration of genocide in Darfur, Sudan. Finally, we all got it. And as a result of Don's persistence, working with both sides of the aisle to address the atrocities in genocide, his bill passed this declaration of genocide with bipartisan support. I was honored to serve on Congressman Payne's subcommittee for many, many years, the Subcommittee on Africa. He was a brilliant and a fair chairman, and he helped me shepherd and negotiate many bills and many of my legislative efforts. And yes, I was blessed to have visited Don on Thursday afternoon. He smiled, we talked, he whispered a few words, but he gave me a thumbs up. I met Don Payne through the mail in 1998 when my predecessor, who I know sends his condolences today, Congressman Ron Dellums, told him I was running for Congress. He sent me a wonderful note then, didn't even know him, and a contribution. And when I was elected, he came up to me and he hugged me, and he became my mentor on so many issues. In closing, let me just say that I know, and we talked a lot about this, and I've been to church with him. Don Payne was a humble man of tremendous faith. And in thinking of Don this evening, I'm reminded of a scripture taken from the 2nd chapter of Timothy, verse 6 to 8. It says, "As for me, the hour has come for me to be sacrificed. The time is here for me to leave this life. I have done my best in the race. I have run the full distance, and I have kept the faith. And now there is waiting for me the victory prize of being put right with God, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but to all those who wait with love for him to appear." May Don's soul rest in peace.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. I would now like to yield to the distinguished gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Madam Speaker, the untimely passing of my good friend and colleague, Congressman Donald Payne, early this morning is a terrible loss for Donald's family and friends, the House of Representatives, the people of the 10th Congressional District of New Jersey, and our nation. Donald Payne was a tireless advocate for his constituents at the local and municipal level before winning the election to the House more than 2 decades ago. As New Jersey's first, and until his death, only African-American member of Congress, he was the voice of working families from all backgrounds who called the 10th District their home. I am privileged to have known and worked with Donald Payne. I will always be grateful to him for the warm way he welcomed me into this House and into the Congressional Black Caucus. I know that my father, who worked with Donald for more than 10 years, joins me in extending our family's sympathies to Donald's family, friends, colleagues, and constituents. As the people of Newark and across the state of New Jersey mourn the loss of their friend Donald Payne, the people of St. Louis, all of Missouri, and all across our country mourn with them. His leadership, friendship, and passion for his work will be missed, and Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I now would like to yield time to the distinguished gentleman from New Orleans, Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
Thank you for yielding, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the time. It was once said that a politician worries about the next election, but a statesman worries about the next generation. Don Payne was a statesman. To the Payne family, I offer my sincere condolences and prayers. Thank you for sharing your brother and your father with us. Well, I do not have as many personal memories as my colleagues of serving with Congressman Payne. I stand here as a beneficiary of his work over his 77 years. I can honestly say, but not for Donald Payne, I probably wouldn't be here. I, along with others of my generation and the generations after me, not only in America but all across the world, stand on the shoulders of Congressman Payne. So I have the honor and the pleasure of serving with him, but I also have the obligation on behalf of those generations to say thank you to Congressman Payne for making this world a better place for us. If we can remember anything with his passing, we can be rest assured that Donald Payne did what he was purposed to accomplish in his lifetime. So I can say right now, without a doubt, that Donald Payne earned the right to say exactly what Paul said to Timothy, and that is, I have fought the good fight, I've finished the race, and I have kept the faith. So, Mr. Speaker, this body, this country, the entire world, we lost a true gentleman in Donald Payne, and we lost a quintessential statesman. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back. Thank you for the time.
Madam Speaker, I would yield now time to my colleague and friend from Memphis, fellow Tennessee, and Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. I appreciate the time. It is everything's been said just about Congressman Payne, and by such wonderful gentlemen and gentle ladies. It pays tribute to the man. I had the opportunity to meet him early in my entry into the Congress, and he made me feel at home from day one. He was indeed a gentleman, quiet, but with a marvelous record for peace, for justice, for the people, the downtrodden who needed a helping hand. I had the opportunity through the auspices of CARE and the Gates Foundation to travel with Congressman Payne and his brother and others to Rwanda and to Goma in the Congo this past August. And I saw how he was beloved among people in Africa, where he had traveled on many occasions before. We shared the experience of going to the memorial to the victims of the genocide there, and Congressman Payne told me some stories about when he'd been there with President Clinton. And President Clinton had gone back and expressed his regrets at not having done more earlier to prevent the genocide, but was strong in supporting the nation of Rwanda and the people's getting their country back together. Donald Payne had a progressive record. He was respected and loved by all. I was fortunate that my life intersected with his, for he made me feel at home as a member of this Congress, and as so many other members of the Congressional Black Caucus have done, make it to where it wasn't necessary to be a member of the Congressional Black Caucus to be with the Congressional Black Caucus. I value my time with him and yield back the remainder of my time.
I inquire how much time we have.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I thank the, Madam Speaker, thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to yield now to the gentleman from South Carolina, our Assistant Leader, Congressman Jim Clyburn.
I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time. Madam Speaker, I often quote the poet Robert Frost, who once admonished us that two roads diverged in a wood, and I picked the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I would not quarrel with Mr. Frost, but I would believe that it's the people that you meet as you travel the roads of life that really makes the difference with all of us. And several years before I came to this body, I met Donald Payne. I was a bit in awe of him because he struck out to attain a seat here. And in that race, right after I met him, things did not go as he had hoped, as many of us had hoped. But Don did not lose faith. He gathered himself, and he tried again. And of course, upon his success, all of us know what a successful congressman he made. I traveled with Don often. We went to Africa together, and traveling with him on the continent of Africa, going in and out of country after country, sitting with him as he called heads of states by their names, and to see the respect that all of them had for him was just a joy to behold. I learned a lot from Donald Payne, and I always, whenever I could, wanted to be around him. Just this past December, in my congressional district, Donald came to Charleston to help me participate on the congressional panel talking about sustaining good, healthy communities. Don, on that particular day, was sort of the star, as he usually was. I had no idea at that time that we would be in this place today, but I think I could say without any threat of contradiction that if anybody has left his or her mark on service in this body, it was Donald Payne. His record will never, in my estimation, be equaled. To know two continents as well as he did is something few people in this body will ever get to attain. I want to join with my colleagues in wishing his family, his brother Bill that I got to know so well, his son Donald Jr. and other family members as much sympathy as I can muster, and I hope that they will achieve real solace in the fact that their brother, their dad, their uncle gave so much and demanded so little in return. With that, I'll yield back.
Now I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Representative Danny Davis.
I thank the lady for yielding. We've heard a great deal about Representative Payne this evening. And some of the fondest memories that I have of Donald was talking, he was a philosopher and a poet. And all of the things that people have said that he did, he has done those. The last conversation we had was sort of a philosophical conversation. And I believe that Tennyson framed Donald Payne long before he was born. And he wrote this poem that said, "Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me, and may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea, but such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. Twilight and evening bail, and after that the dark, and may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. For though from out our bourne of time and place the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar." Donald crossed, but he left a great deal behind. And I yield back.
Now I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from New York, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke.
I thank my colleague Barbara Lee. Madam Speaker, today I'm here to pay tribute to a quintessential public servant, a person who tirelessly fought on behalf of his constituents in the 10th Congressional District of New Jersey and for all Americans of all backgrounds across this nation. Today I pay tribute and celebrate the life of our beloved colleague, Congressman Donald Payne. You know, Donald made history as the first African American in New Jersey to be elected to Congress. He served as the former chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus and was recent chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, where I really saw him go to work on behalf of the people across this nation. Along with many others, I considered Representative Payne not just an accomplished colleague, but a role model and a dear friend. He was a relentless and iconic advocate for the continent of Africa, the African diaspora, as well as the Caribbean region. He spoke boldly. He spoke out boldly against genocide in Darfur and Rwanda, and fought alongside the Congressional Black Caucus to help Haiti recover from the devastating earthquake that struck the nation in 2010. Congressman Payne was a representative of Newark, but his leadership was global. He was grateful, we are grateful, for his worldview. We will never forget his passion, zeal, and commitment to improve the United States diplomatic relations around the world. I count myself fortunate to have established a real bond with Congressman Payne. He shared with me his quick wit, and we shared a lot of laughs together. We often joked about who was tougher, Newark or Brooklyn. And you know, he was also very skilled on the dance floor. I had an opportunity to trip the world fantastic with Mr. Payne. And so I extend my condolences to his son, Councilman Donald Payne, Jr., and to his very devoted brother, his daughters, Nicole and Wanda, his great-grandchildren, his close friends, his devoted staff, and the people of the 10th Congressional District of New Jersey. Know that he has left us a great legacy, building blocks, if you will, for future generations of leaders. We will continue to celebrate the contributions of this great statesman. The stars in the heavens will twinkle just a bit brighter as Congressman Donald Payne makes his transition to be with our Creator in heaven. Thank you, Congressman, for all your commitment and sacrifice for the betterment of our global community. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Now I'd like to yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Congressman Price.
Mr. Speaker, it was with great sadness that I learned of the passing of my good friend and colleague, Donald Payne. Few members who've served in this institution have left a greater impression on their constituents, their colleagues, and their country's domestic and foreign policy than Don Payne. From the moment Don set foot in Congress, he was a powerful advocate for the needs and interests of his central New Jersey community and of working Americans across our country. Bringing to bear his impressive and diverse record as a public school teacher, president of the National Council of YMCAs, and an elected official in Newark, Don quickly became one of the most forceful and effective advocates for public education in the Congress, playing a key role as a member of the Education and Labor Committee on virtually every major educational reform enacted over the last 2 decades. As the first African-American elected to Congress from New Jersey, Don was an equally forceful advocate for the continued struggle for civil rights, eventually becoming chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Now, these accomplishments in education and civil rights would qualify as a successful career for any member. But Don didn't stop there. Driven by his early fascination with Africa and his adventuresome travels there, Don recognized that the struggle for civil rights and human dignity knew no borders, rising to become one of the most effective chairmen of the Foreign Affairs, Africa, and Global Health Subcommittee that we have ever had in this institution. Our nation's expanded focus on AIDS, malaria, and other pandemic diseases over the past decade would simply not have occurred without Don's visionary leadership and moral courage. It was fitting that USAID announced the launch of a Donald Payne Fellowship program last week designed to help young people enter careers in international service. I was fortunate to benefit from Don's knowledge and advocacy personally as he became a founding member of the bipartisan House Democracy Partnership, which I co-chair with my California colleague, Representative David Dreyer. Don's counsel and guidance and encouragement were invaluable as the House Democracy Partnership initiated partnerships with legislatures in Africa and conducted outreach in countries affected by the Arab Spring. Our frequent travels together in the region forged a deep and lasting friendship. He probably knew more about the ins and outs of Africa politics than all the other members of this institution combined. He had strong and well-informed views about what our country's policies should be, and he was ready to articulate those views persuasively, no matter who the president was or which party was in charge. He also insisted on investigating situations on the ground for himself, which led to quite a few one-man codels and some anxious moments for those who wanted to pre-package congressional visits or maintain airtight security. It was fascinating to talk to him about his diplomatic forays, which offered a combination of high adventure and a remarkable, inspiring dedication to the freedom and dignity of the people of Africa. Congress has lost a true statesman, a dedicated humanitarian, and a loyal public service. We mourn his passing, and we will miss Don Payne's counsel and friendship.
Excuse me. Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield now to the gentlelady from Florida, Congresswoman Brown.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you for yielding. Often I say God is good, and the audience say all the time, but God has been good for giving us the life of Donald Payne. Well, you know, when you're born, you get a birth certificate, and when you die, you get a death certificate, and that dash in between is what you have done to make this place a better place. And Don Payne have done his work. And when I think of what Paul said, you have fought a good fight, and he has, and you finished the course. But there is still work for us to do. I remember we talk about Donald Payne and all of his work in Africa, and I don't know anyone that knew the continent or the people more than Donald Payne. But I want to mention that my first trip as a member of Congress was with Congressman Payne, and we went to Ireland, and we went to other countries. He was an international leader, and I want to thank his family, the constituents that sent him here, and you know that you sent someone here that loved the Lord, but more than that, he was what we want our public servants to be, someone that actually believed in serving the public. And so Donald's work speaks for itself. And we are so grateful that we've had the opportunity to serve with him. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I want to put my statement in the record. Thank you.
Now I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Congresswoman Donna Christensen.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lee. And thank you, everyone who's come out to pay tribute to Donald Payne this evening, and thank you, Father Conroy, for being here with us. I recently had the opportunity to introduce Donald at an annual gala of the Mountainside Marketing Group, where he was being honored with the 2011 Congressional Minority Business Award, and it was really an honor to do that. I talked then about his commitment to Africa and how I always told Donald I would never travel with him. You see, he was as comfortable, as you've heard, meeting rebels in the jungle as he was meeting presidents and chiefs. State Department warnings meant nothing to him. You heard about his plane being shot at in Mogadishu, and he also did some jail time here at home for protests on behalf of justice here and abroad. Because of the high respect in which he was held by everyone on all sides, he was able to bring peace to warring factions, to broker truce, and to ease the pathway to democracy for many. And his legacy as a peacemaker was not limited to Africa. He's considered an honorary son of Ireland for his contributions there. I talked that evening about his commitment to children. As a teacher, he used his senior position on education and labor to ensure that educational opportunities are available for all children, but especially poor and minority children. He worked hard to close the achievement gap and was also a key player in legislation to reduce interest rates on college loans and to increase Pell Grants. I was able to tell those gathered how working families had no stronger supporter of labor and worker protections than Donald Payne. Last year, the Health Brain Trust and all of our partners honored Donald with the Congressional Leadership Award. I had the honor also of traveling to Newark every other year to the Donald Payne Health Summits and health fairs. He was just as determined that the people in his district have access to quality health care as he was committed to their education and economic opportunity. It was always an event that was looked forward to and attended by thousands who were then connected to the healthcare system, some for the very first time. But his commitment to health extended beyond his district to our entire country, to Africa and the Caribbean. He made sure that global health was added to the responsibility of the Subcommittee on Africa, which he chaired. He led the effort to increase PEPFAR funding more than threefold. When President Bush signaled his willingness to go from 15 to 30 billion over 5 years, Donald took that as an opening to push for even more, and with Barbara Lee and others, parlayed that to $48 billion. He also led in ensuring that for the first time all the countries in the Caribbean would be included. So it's no surprise that condolences are pouring in from all over the world, and I want to submit one from Dr. Claire Nelson on behalf of the Institute of Caribbean Studies. There were only a few of us that knew that Donald was diagnosed with cancer and undergoing treatment. He was truly amazing. I thought he was even more feisty after his diagnosis than before. He would add his humorous commentary even more often at our meetings. He teased many of us mercilessly. He led the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation with boundless energy, which of course all of us on the board and the staff had to try to keep up with. His most recent boat ride, at which he takes pictures with everyone who comes, was lots of fun as always, and he thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it, as all of us did. His work in this body, of course, never faltered, and I think he might have been a more formidable adversary or advocate, as the case might have been. But above all, Donald was a dear friend. In the end, he succumbed to the cancer, but up until the very last, he lived his life to the fullest. The people of the U.S. Virgin Islands, and he visited us several times, my family and staff joined me in extending our heartfelt sympathy to his family, his children, Donald Jr., Wanda and Nicole, his 4 grandchildren, and his great-grandchild, to his brother Bill and sister Catherine, to Laverne and all of his staff, past and present, here and in the district, and to the people of the 10th District of New Jersey. Donald was not only a respected member of the Congressional Black Caucus, which he chaired, he was loved by all of us. We will miss him terribly, but we will remember him with such great affection and consider ourselves blessed to have known him, to have served with him, and to have him call us his friend.